scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa noticed something strange about her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Instead of her usual smile, the reflection was frowning with darker eyes. When Peppa waved, the reflection moved a second too late, as if thinking about whether to copy her movements. George was playing with his dinosaur when he heard whispers from inside the toy box. The whispers grew louder in an unknown language that made him feel cold. When he opened the box, all his toys were arranged in a perfect circle, facing outward, as if they had been watching him play. Mummy Pig was cooking when she noticed the family portrait had changed. All family members were still smiling, but their eyes had turned completely black, with extra shadows behind them. Every time she looked away and back, the shadows moved closer to the family in the photograph. Daddy Pig was reading when he realized the same news story appeared on every page. The story was about a pig family who disappeared, leaving only empty clothes and a house full of mirrors that reflected nothing at all. As night fell, the family gathered for dinner, but something was wrong. The food kept changing when they weren't looking. Peppa's carrots became tiny orange eyes that blinked. George's potatoes turned into gray stones that whispered his name. The parents' meals transformed into things that looked like food but smelled like forgotten places. The lights flickered, and with each flicker, their shadows moved independently, performing actions none of them were doing. Peppa's shadow pointed behind her, George's shadow covered its eyes, and the parents' shadows reached protectively toward their children. When they tried to leave, every door led back to the same room. The windows showed not their garden, but an endless gray landscape where other pig families walked in mechanical circles, their faces blank and eyes reflecting no light. The telephone rang, but Daddy Pig heard his own voice warning about dangers he didn't understand. The voice told him they were no longer in their real house, but in a place where lost families go when they stay too long in front of mirrors. As night deepened, they realized other versions of themselves moved through the rooms, slightly different versions that walked through walls and spoke in reverse. These other selves tried to communicate something important through incomprehensible whispers and gestures. The final realization came when Peppa looked outside and saw their real selves in the garden, calling for help and trying to get into a house that no longer existed. They understood they had become the reflections, trapped forever in a mirror world where nothing was real, and the only escape was to find someone else to take their place. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through their window, and everything seemed normal. Mummy Pig called them down for breakfast, her voice echoing through the house in that familiar, cheerful way. But as Peppa walked down the stairs, she noticed something strange. The family portraits on the wall seemed different somehow. The smiles in the pictures looked too wide, too forced, as if they were hiding something terrible behind them. At breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper as usual, but when he looked up to greet the children, his eyes appeared completely black for just a moment before returning to normal. Peppa blinked, thinking she must have imagined it. George was playing with his toy dinosaur, making his usual dinosaur noises, but the sounds seemed to echo strangely in the kitchen, as if the room was much larger than it should be. After breakfast, Peppa and George decided to play in the garden. The weather was beautiful, but as they stepped outside, they noticed that all the flowers in the garden had turned black overnight. The grass beneath their feet felt cold and damp, even though it hadn't rained. The swing set creaked ominously in the breeze, moving back and forth even though no one was pushing it. George pointed to the muddy puddles they loved to jump in, but today the water looked darker than usual, almost like thick, black paint. When Peppa looked closer, she could see strange shapes moving beneath the surface. She called for Mummy Pig, but her voice seemed to disappear into the air, as if the garden was swallowing all sound. Suddenly, their friend Susie Sheep appeared at the garden gate. But something was wrong with Susie. Her wool was matted and gray, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. When she smiled, her teeth appeared sharp and pointed, nothing like the friendly Susie they knew. She spoke in a voice that sounded like multiple people talking at once, asking if Peppa and George wanted to play a new game. The game, Susie explained, was called Forever Friends. The rules were simple. Once you started playing, you could never stop. You would play together for all eternity, never growing up, never going home, never seeing your family again. George began to cry, but his tears turned to black drops that stained the ground where they fell. Peppa tried to run back to the house, but the door had vanished. Where the entrance used to be, there was only a solid wall. The windows had disappeared too, leaving the house looking like a giant, featureless box. George's crying grew louder and more desperate, but the sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. More of their friends began to appear in the garden. Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and Candy Cat all emerged from behind the trees, but they all looked wrong. Their colors were faded and dull, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded Peppa and George, chanting in unison about the wonderful game they were all going to play together. As the circle of friends closed in, Peppa noticed that the sky above them was changing. The bright blue was slowly turning to deep purple, then to black. Stars began to appear, but they weren't twinkling normally. Instead, they pulsed like heartbeats, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that made Peppa feel dizzy and sick. The last thing Peppa remembered was Susie Sheep's voice, now sounding like a whisper that came from inside her own head, saying that the game was about to begin and that they would all be the best of friends forever and ever, in a place where time stood still and no one ever had to say goodbye. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the window, and everything appeared normal. Peppa stretched and yawned, looking over at George, who was still sleeping peacefully in the bottom bunk. But something felt different today. As Peppa climbed down from her bed, she noticed that her reflection in the bedroom mirror seemed to move just a fraction of a second after she did. She stopped and stared at the mirror, but her reflection appeared perfectly normal now. George stirred and opened his eyes, but when he looked at Peppa, his usual cheerful expression was replaced by something else entirely. George's eyes had changed. They were still the same size and shape, but they seemed darker somehow, as if shadows had crept into them during the night. When he smiled at Peppa, his grin stretched just a little too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Her back was turned to the children as they entered, and she was humming a tune that Peppa had never heard before. The melody was strange and unsettling. When Mummy Pig turned around, her smile was as warm as always, but her eyes had the same dark quality that Peppa had noticed in George. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper at the breakfast table, but the pages were completely blank. He turned each empty page with great interest, occasionally chuckling at invisible jokes. When Peppa pointed this out, Daddy Pig looked at her with confusion and insisted that he was reading the most fascinating article. The house itself began to feel different as the morning progressed. Rooms seemed to be in slightly different places than they were the day before. The hallway appeared longer, and doors that Peppa was certain led to familiar rooms now opened onto spaces she had never seen before. One door revealed a room filled entirely with mirrors, each one showing a slightly different version of whoever looked into them. By afternoon, more friends had arrived to play, but they too had changed. Susie Sheep's wool had turned a shade of gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The playground where they usually played had transformed overnight. The swings moved by themselves in the still air, creaking with a rhythm that sounded almost like whispered words. As evening approached, the changes became more pronounced. The sun set in the wrong direction, casting shadows that fell upward instead of down. The familiar yellow house on the hill had developed extra windows that glowed with an inner light. When bedtime arrived, Peppa and George climbed into their beds as usual, but sleep would not come easily. The house creaked and settled around them, but the sounds were different now, more deliberate. The last thing Peppa remembered before finally drifting off to sleep was the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their room. These weren't the familiar footsteps of Mummy or Daddy Pig. These steps were lighter, more numerous, as if many small feet were walking back and forth throughout the night.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa noticed something strange about her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The reflection smiled back at her, but Peppa wasn't smiling. She blinked, and for a moment the reflection didn't blink back. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the living room when he heard whispers coming from the walls. The whispers spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but somehow he knew they were calling his name. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner in the kitchen when all the family photos on the wall began to change. In each picture, the family's smiles became wider and wider, stretching beyond what should be possible. Their eyes grew darker, like empty holes staring back at her. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in his favorite chair when the words on the pages started rearranging themselves, spelling out messages that made no sense, yet filled him with inexplicable dread. That night, Peppa couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear footsteps in the hallway. But when she looked, no one was there. The footsteps were small, like a child's, but they moved in a rhythm that didn't match any normal walking pattern. George's room was across the hall, and she could see his door was slightly open. Through the crack, she glimpsed something moving in the darkness that was too tall to be George. The next morning, the family gathered for breakfast, but something was wrong with their shadows. While they sat at the table eating, their shadows on the wall were standing up, moving independently, reaching toward each other with elongated arms. Peppa tried to tell her parents, but when she spoke, her voice came out as someone else's whisper. At playgroup, Susie Sheep noticed that Peppa's eyes had changed color overnight. They were still brown, but there was something else behind them, something that watched and waited. During playtime, all the toys in the room began moving on their own, arranging themselves in perfect circles around the children. The teacher, Madame Gazelle, smiled her usual smile, but her reflection in the window showed something entirely different. When the family returned home that evening, they found that their house had gained an extra room. A door that had never been there before stood at the end of the upstairs hallway. Behind the door, they could hear the sound of children playing, but the voices didn't belong to Peppa or George. The voices belonged to children who sounded exactly like them, but spoke words they had never said. As night fell, the Pig family realized they were no longer alone in their house. There were others now, others who looked just like them, but weren't quite right. These others lived in the mirrors, in the shadows, in the spaces between the walls. And slowly, very slowly, they were beginning to take over, one reflection at a time.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom. But something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed, Peppa noticed her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction of a second too late, as if it was trying to catch up with her movements. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa looked closely, she saw that Mummy Pig's eyes had turned completely black, like two dark holes in her face. Yet Mummy Pig continued cooking as if nothing had changed, her movements mechanical and precise. George was sitting at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his toy dinosaur as usual. Instead, he was staring directly at Peppa with an unsettling grin that stretched far too wide across his face. His teeth, normally small and harmless, had become sharp and pointed like tiny daggers. The family car ride to playgroup felt endless. Daddy Pig drove in complete silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Through the car windows, Peppa could see that all the other houses in their neighborhood had their curtains drawn shut, and no other cars were on the road. When they arrived at the playgroup, the building looked exactly the same from the outside, but something was terribly wrong. The playground was empty, and the swings moved back and forth in the windless air as if invisible children were playing on them. The slide that was usually bright yellow had faded to a sickly pale color. Inside the classroom, all of Peppa's friends were already seated in a perfect circle. Susie Sheep, Rebecca Rabbit, Pedro Pony, and all the others sat motionless with their backs straight and their hands folded neatly in their laps. Their eyes had the same black emptiness that Peppa had seen in Mummy Pig's face. Madame Gazelle stood at the front of the classroom, but her usual warm smile had been replaced by something cold and calculating. When she spoke, her voice echoed strangely, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. She announced that today they would be playing a very special game, one that had never been played before. The game was simple, Madame Gazelle explained. Each child would take turns standing in the center of the circle while the others watched in complete silence. But as each friend took their turn, something horrible happened. They would stand up normally, but then their bodies would begin to change, stretching and twisting into impossible shapes. Peppa watched in horror as Susie Sheep's wool began to fall out in clumps, revealing gray, mottled skin underneath. Rebecca Rabbit's ears grew longer and longer until they dragged on the floor behind her. Pedro Pony's mane turned from brown to black and began to move like it was alive, writhing and reaching toward the other children. When it was finally Peppa's turn to stand in the center, she felt a strange tingling sensation spreading through her body. She looked down at her hands and saw that her pink skin was becoming translucent, and she could see dark veins pulsing underneath. Her red dress began to change color, shifting from bright red to deep crimson to black. The other children began to chant in unison, their voices creating a low, hypnotic hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the classroom. The words they spoke were in no language Peppa had ever heard, but somehow she understood their meaning. They were calling to something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for a very long time. As the chanting grew louder, the classroom began to change around them. The cheerful yellow walls darkened to a deep purple, and the windows became black as night. The toys and books that lined the shelves began to move on their own, rearranging themselves into strange patterns and symbols. Peppa tried to run toward the door, but her legs wouldn't obey her commands. She was trapped in the center of the circle, unable to move as the transformation continued. Her reflection in the classroom mirror showed something that was no longer quite Peppa, but something else entirely, something with too many teeth and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. The episode ended with Peppa's family driving home in the same eerie silence. But now Peppa sat in the back seat with the same black eyes and mechanical movements as the rest of her family. The car passed by other houses where other families were returning from their own strange days. All of them changed, all of them part of something larger and more terrifying than anyone could imagine. As they pulled into their driveway, Peppa looked up at her bedroom window and saw another version of herself looking back down, the version that had never left the house, the version that was still normal. But as she watched, that other Peppa slowly raised her hand and waved goodbye before the curtains closed forever.